And we are live. It's not 2:30 p.m., it's 3:30 p.m., but it's a Wednesday afternoon. And as you know, it's an Innovation Fika, Innovation Coffee Break with Donny, live from Stockholm, Sweden, at KTH. Again, at KTH. Different location this time, because this week at KTH, we're hosting a huge international conference, Times Higher Education Impact and Innovation Summit 2022. And that's what we'll be talking about today. Just very, very briefly about me. My name is Donny. I do this show every week. I usually work at the Innovation Office at KTH. But follow me online. I post almost daily on LinkedIn on entrepreneurship, innovation, inspiration, and whatever other fun stuff that could be there. All of my written content is on Medium, and all of these recorded videos every Wednesday is on YouTube. This is actually episode 61 today. Episode 61 of my Innovation Fika, Innovation Coffee Break. Fika, of course, in Swedish means a break when we leave our desk and sit down and speak to people about other things than our job, and come up with incredibly innovative ideas and start a new company. Kind of. Anyway, enough about me, enough about that. Today, I'm so happy that I managed to, I'll say, get Mr. Duncan Ross into my studio. Look at this, a beautiful studio here as well. Duncan, thank you so much for spending this half an hour with me.
It's my pleasure, Donny.
And welcome to this coffee break. And everybody online, make sure to post your questions in the feed, just as normal. We'll take live questions as they come along. But coming back to Duncan then, I always start these coffee breaks by saying, hello, welcome guest, who are you and what do you do?
So my name's Duncan Ross. I'm the Chief Data Officer for Times Higher Education. That might not mean much to anyone, but what we do, or what we've been doing for the last 50 years, is trying to report on what higher education is and what higher education does. So universities around the world. And for a lot of time, that was through our magazine, which still exists. Fantastic journalism. You can get that online. But we also do university rankings. And university rankings are interesting because, well, they're interesting to me because I'm a data scientist and I love data, but they're interesting because they give us an insight into the world of higher education that we can't easily get otherwise. Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much. And so your job as a data officer then is to, in charge of data,
I have a team of data scientists and data collectors. We call them data editors, makes them sound grand. And we collect the data from universities. We collect data from other sources. We compile it. We run tests to make sure it's credible, reliable. And then we publish the rankings, but that's not the end of it.
No, okay.
You know, rankings, I would say you have to be a little bit careful. They're theatre, they're fun, they're interesting, but it's a bit like football. Just because Manchester City is at the top of the Premier League doesn't necessarily mean they're the best team. I say this as a Newcastle United supporter, obviously.
Of course.
You know, they play defensively. Oh, no, not very good. There are other things that make universities great, not just how high up they get the league table. Each university is different. It has different missions, different focuses. And that's what we're trying to do as well, is dig below that data to understand the stories. What can this tell me about where universities are good, where there is room for improvement, and what that means on a worldwide scale?
And that's really interesting, because that sort of leads us to, I mean, I wrote a headline for this talk, which was, I don't know, how do university rankings work actually? You know, how does it actually work and what do they actually do? And I think it's fascinating because as a Swedish university, KTH, just taking one very specific thing as an example, we don't own any of the research results. So if you count patents, if you only count patents, Swedish universities, 0. So, we never really come very high up in those rankings if
you measure patents in that way. Now, this is one of the great things about data science. So data science is not fundamentally about writing complex algorithms and GP3 and neural nets and stuff, although some of it is, but most of it is actually about understanding the question you're trying to ask, making sure you can translate that into an analytical question, and then the really messy bit, which is collecting data and cleaning data and cleaning data and cleaning data. It's miserable, but you have to do it.
Yeah, cleaning data is interesting because if we look at a slight foray into the data management part of it, which is detached from maybe today's subject, but in general, when people say big data, or let me just say, when people say massive amounts of data, that is kind of useless, because massive amount of data doesn't really do anything unless you've
Well, unless you know what you want to get out of it. I mean, massive amounts of data can contain really valid insights and useful insights that you can't get otherwise. So stepping away from universities a little bit, if you think about the Internet of Things, and everyone thinks the Internet of Things is something that's brand new. It's been around for ages. Yeah. We've had thousands of control valves, for example, which are freely on the internet. Don't go search for those kiddies. You don't want to switch stuff off that you shouldn't. But they are generating tons and tons of data. And some of that is really interesting, but only if you can clean that data, you understand what it means, and you can ask the right question.
I remember speaking to one of the strategic leads of one of the truck manufacturers in Sweden. And this was like
how many truck manufacturers are there in Sweden?
Oh, well, in Sweden, you can't throw an electric kick bike without hitting a incubator, but a truck manufacturer, no, but two major ones. And this was a number of years ago, and this was just in the beginning of the whole sort of data processing age. And he said, the thing is, everything is connected, and all of our trucks are connected, and we're generating 1 terabyte per hour that we're just storing
in the hope that at some point,
exactly.
And the great thing about truck companies, I know because I did some work with an Italian truck company. We'll not name it, but let's call it Truck Company I. They were, and this is obviously again prior to Times Higher Education. They were in exactly the same position. They had, well, not hundreds, but I think there were about 20 odd different computers within each truck, all of which were generating data. All of that data was potentially useful. And yet, despite the fact they were fundamentally an engineering company, they didn't necessarily know how to get the value out of it. And sometimes the solutions, by the way, weren't computer science solutions at all. They were pushed the ECU back in.
But then, jumping back to the subject,
we are straying.
But this is it, because this is interesting. So let's look at the university and say, how many data points? I mean, there must be a lot.
There are potentially, but universities are, and this is one of the fun things about this role, universities are all unique.
Yeah.
They all have different structures, different ways of operating. If you go to different countries, you find that subjects are classified differently, degrees are of different lengths, etc., etc. So although there's a lot of data in universities, most of it isn't very consistent. And so one of the great challenges we have at Times Higher Education is, how do we create definitions that allow universities to report their data to us in a way that is fair and consistent? Some simple things. What's a student? You'd think that was a fairly, well, it looks like you're questioning that yourself. It sounds like a fairly straightforward question, but the definition of a student is not as obvious as you might think. Do you count summer students? What about part-time students? What about exchange students? Student who comes in then leaves after 6 months. All of this starts to make it more complex when you're trying to calculate. And then I say, I just want the students who study physics. Well, what about the ones who study astrophysics or physics and French or physics? Life gets more complicated.
Indeed. I mean, we have that problem at KTH Innovation, because to come to us, I mean, we're a very open, low threshold, come with your idea, but you have to have a KTH affiliation, right?
Yes.
So for students, it's like you need to be a student at KTH. And then you have people who, they maybe started their studies, we're talking years, a decade ago, but kind of never really finished. And
there are some countries where you can do that. The US, Italy, you can stay in that kind of ghost-like status pretty much indefinitely.
So how much do you influence? I mean, how much is it for you to tell universities, these are the data points we are going to measure? Or how much is it sort of, which data points do you have that we can measure? I mean, what's the...
There's kind of a balance there. And we have done some experiments in the past where we tried to measure things. We tried to measure some data around innovation, and we looked at the number of patents. You've already explained why that's difficult. We looked at the amount of income from consultancy. And what we found is actually, in that case, the data that universities were able to provide wasn't consistent, it wasn't reliable. You could just look at it statistically. There were outliers left, right, and center. And so we decided not to go down that route. So that was a learning experience based on practically trying it out.
Yeah.
Can you give us the data? Well, no, you can't. So we looked for something else to do.
We actually got a question here from Ali here online. Ali Juma saying, what kind of data do you collect from universities? I mean, that comes back to what we're talking about, I guess, but what?
So at the most basic level, the kind of things we collect, or the kind of things we used to collect, would be things like student numbers, faculty numbers, broken down by different subject areas. Income is interesting because it tells us both about the capacity of the university to do research, but also the capacity to teach. So that was the kind of data that ourselves and most other ranking organizations would collect from universities. We do have access to other data sets like bibliometrics and also opinion surveys, but that's the kind of thing we would collect normally. 4 years ago, we started a different project, and that was to try and understand how good universities were at sustainability and specifically at addressing the Sustainable Development Goals. And for that, we had to start collecting very different data. And some of that data is about the practices of a university. We want to know if the university is working with its community. We want to know if it has the right policies in place to deliver SDG 10 reduced inequalities. And so we had to ask universities for evidence of what they were doing rather than simply quantitative data.
So, and this, I mean, this week actually then is because I know there are, as you said, there are a number of different kinds of rankings out there in the world. And I mean, how many? I think there are not many, but there's a couple of organizations that work with ranking. None of them as good as yours, of course, obviously. But this specific week here is the Impact and Innovation ranking, or what do we call it? We
call it the Times Higher Education Impact Rankings.
The Times Higher Education Impact Ranking. Okay.
And what that is our attempt to understand how universities can contribute to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Okay. It's actually more than one ranking. We have an overall ranking because you kind of have to have that. It's like the league table. But we also have one ranking for each of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals.
Okay.
And that gives us very different insights. One of the things that comes out of this is that we see universities from the global south perform much more strongly in this type of ranking than they do in some of the traditional research-focused rankings.
And and this evening, it's like, this is a Wednesday afternoon, and Wednesday evening is the great unveiling of this year's results. I won't ask you to tell me anything but is there anything you can say about the? No, but
I won't ask you, but between you and me, just us and
exactly. But there's disregard everybody online. No, but I was going to say that since we see this as a World Cup in football, soccer for all of the non-Europeans, where the host nation always is highly, you're seeded and you're automatically sort of in the top 10.
That's not how this works, unfortunately. In fact, we kind of had an internal joke is too strong a word, but we did notice that places we went to for events tended to drop down the rankings that year. We may have broken that tonight. Who knows?
Well, that's probably why they stopped asking you to come.
No, it's not the only reason.
No, but then on this specific ranking, it sounds difficult to actually say, here's number 1, 2, 3, 4, because it's kind of an intangible. Is it not?
Well, it is and it isn't. I mean, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, created in 2015, the UN itself created 223 targets as part of those 17 goals. So there are some quite precise things that the United Nations wants to encourage in terms of behavior. The difficulty, though, is that goals weren't written for universities.
No.
In fact, universities are mentioned once explicitly, and I think they're implied once in all 300 odd pages of documentation. So we had to try and find a way that we could interpret what those targets meant from a higher education perspective.
Okay.
And that's what we tried to do. And one of the things you should be aware about all rankings is that all rankings are wrong. Some of them, however, are useful. And that's what we're trying to achieve here, something that is useful, something that, yes, it tells us a little bit about which universities are good and which universities are not so good. But it also encourages universities to do more. It encourages them to take sustainability seriously, to build it into their strategies, and to deliver on the SDGs.
So in that way, it's kind of a steering instrument as well, or no, so steering might be a hard word.
No. I think intentionally we set it up, and this is probably quite controversial. We set it up to both record, but also to guide.
Yes.
And that puts an extra level of responsibility on us. If all we're doing is recording, we can say, well, okay, we choose to measure these things because they're interesting to us, and you can agree or disagree, and it doesn't really matter. Or at least it shouldn't. Universities take these things far too seriously sometimes. But when it comes to the impact rankings, because we are also trying to encourage best practice, it means we need to think carefully about what we measure and try and ensure we don't end up with unintended consequences. That by measuring something, we encourage a behavior which actually overall is negative. And part of that, I've been working with the United Nations Higher Education Sustainability Initiative to try and create a set of guidelines which will help rankings organizations, not just us, but all rankings organizations and assessors, to think about how they measure these things in both an effective way, but also in a reasonable and fair way. And equity is also really important here. You know, we're standing here with considerable privilege in a nice, wealthy, global North country. There are many people in the world who don't have access to this kind of facilities, but we need to make sure that universities from the global South can both participate and also demonstrate how they are responding to their needs of their communities.
Yeah, and I think that's a very, very important point to make, because in the panel, I moderated the panel before lunch today, and we were talking about how universities can drive responsible innovation. That wasn't the topic, right? So we're talking about that. And it was kind of, I'm not going to say, well, not biased, but biased is the wrong word, but a bit skewed, because it was Denmark, South Korea, and Sweden and Japan.
Yeah.
In the panel, right? And
all countries that have great insights to give.
Of course. But and then we were talking about, you know, the university as a good community citizen, as in a triple or quadruple helix. You know, with universities, you have industry, you have the citizen, and then governments, of course, in the quadruple helix. And my comment was, but when I've been traveling the world, you know, we are very lucky to sort of take that for granted, that we are a welcome citizen in this community as a university. In other countries, some countries, I'm not saying it, there's just the divide.
Well, I mean, the most obvious divide is, you know, we can step back from culture, we can step back from history a degree and simply say it's wealth. It's the luxury of having the resource to have a wonderful facilities like we have here at KTH, or we see in other universities. That in itself is a luxury, and it gives us the capacity to innovate in ways that simply aren't available elsewhere, simply because of wealth. Now, of course, there are then, on top of that, other biases, other challenges that universities and people in other parts of the world have to face on top of that. But it's all linked together. I mean, intersectionality or multicollinearity, depending on whether you want to take a mathematical or a social sciences approach.
So coming back to the ranking then, impact and innovation. No, it wasn't called impact. Impact. What characterizes a university that comes on like the upper 10, 20 of that ranking? Well, what's the characteristics of that?
So what we typically see are universities that have a strategic commitment to sustainability in the SDGs. It's led from the top. So, and I don't mean that to suggest that the grassroots aren't important, but you know, that's really critical. But actually, it's not just the grassroots. It's also the leaders of the university have understood how important this is. And I just want to emphasize that we haven't really. The SDGs were created in 2015 as part of something called Agenda 2030. The goal was to stop the Earth being unlivable, and the target date 2030. We have less than 8 years left to deliver on these. That's really, and we all know how quickly universities can work. So it's really a point in time where we're at an inflection point. We need to move away from contemplation and very much into action. And so strategic leadership is crucial. You know, buying into that, understanding what your universities can do, because universities, we are sometimes, I think, underplay the economic impact of universities. And KTH is in Stockholm, capital city, but there are many universities that are the single biggest employer in their city.
Indeed.
They bring economic benefits. They have a reach far wider than we remember. And if that can all be applied towards sustainability, then actually I think it's a really powerful lever that we can apply.
And just just to compare that to when we talk about student bodies and the student life, Stockholm is per numbers probably the biggest like student body university city in Sweden. However, you don't see them as much in Stockholm. Whereas if you go to a smaller town like Umeå or Luleå or Lund, the student life there is that is the vibrant community, because that's such a big part of the city as well. Just as a comparison.
No, absolutely. We see the same in the United Kingdom. So I live about 30 kilometers from Loughborough, which is a tough one to try and pronounce if you don't know how it's pronounced. But Loughborough, the university, is the biggest single employer. Now, it used to have industry, but that has moved on, and that's not atypical. And the role of universities in regeneration, in sustainability, is really critical.
So coming back to the question about the top 20 or 20, or getting higher up, not saying, but to sort of advance on this sort of scale, on this ranking, are we talking about all the SDGs, or are we doing one?
No, because we thought about that. And so if we had said you need to answer questions on all the SDGs, and we have about 220 different things we ask a university to provide if they want to go for all 17 SDGs. Really, the only way you could do that is if you have the resource to do it. If you have a team of people whose job is to go and collect data. Well, straight away, we've said basically the winners are going to be people from the US, possibly the UK, people who have these big data teams. So instead, we decided, and this is controversial again, we decided we want to take one SDG as the linchpin, something that would link to all the others, and we chose SDG 17, sorry, I think I said 7 there, SDG 17, Partnership for the Goals, because that talks about how all the goals work together and how different parts of society need to work together effectively to deliver goals. So that's our underpinning SDG. And then we say, well, on top of that, you can supply data for all SDGs, but we're looking for just 3. You choose the 3 that are important to you. And that was initially designed really to try and reduce the workload, but it's had another benefit. It's shown us that universities around the world are focusing on the things that mean the most to them.
Yes, in a local context.
In a local context, absolutely. And you'll not be surprised to know that the local context for Sweden is very different than the local context for, say, Delhi. And universities reflect that. If you look overall for Europe, for example, far fewer universities submit data to SDG 1, no poverty, and SDG 2, zero hunger. Because although I'm not saying there isn't poverty and hunger in our societies, there is far less than there is elsewhere. If you look at Southeast Asia or African universities, that is much more one of their focuses. Similarly, in Northern Europe, we see less interest in SDG 6, which is clean water and sanitation. We have lots of water. If you go to the Middle East, water is much more important because of its scarcity. So universities from Jordan, from Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, etc., focus a lot more on those areas.
But when you said to the universities, give us the 3 that you care about, didn't they say, yeah, but which one should we pick?
Yes, some did.
Didn't they want you to tell them?
Well, they are free to enter all of them and look and see which ones they do best at. And some universities choose to supply data for all of them, not because they necessarily think they're going to do well in all of them, but because they want to understand how they can improve. So even if I know I'm not going to be great at SDG 7, what more could I do? What opportunities are there for me to grow and develop my practice so that I am better at it?
Now here is, but how much then is it, we need to submit this so we can learn and grow? Or is it, whatever you do, don't submit this because then we can come high in the ranking?
Well, there is something else about SDG 17, or that we put into our version of SDG 17, which I think is important. And tomorrow morning when I do the launch and talk about the data, I'm going to be emphasizing this. In SDG 17, we also ask universities to report on their progress for all of the SDGs. In actual fact, what we say is, do you publish your progress on the SDGs? Show us what you do. SDG by SDG by SDG. We want, and I think this is really, really important, we want every university to be reporting against every SDG. Even if they're not doing very much in an SDG, at least acknowledge what you are doing and what you aren't doing.
Well, tomorrow, what time tomorrow? Is it broadcast or is it?
So the launch tonight is at 8 p.m. We're going down to the City Hall, which is going to be wonderful. We're going to pretend it's the Nobel Prizes, but
of course,
that's about as close as I will get to one. That's the actual launch, and then the rankings will be live on our website from 8 o'clock.
And I can actually put the, I think it's the general website.
The general website.
timeshighereducation.com, right?
Yes, so, and you look for rankings, impact rancings.
So, and that's tonight?
That's tonight, 8 p.m.
8 p.m. UK or Sweden?
No, of course, we're in Europe.
We're in Europe. So it's CEST, which is GMT +2. Yeah,
probably.
UTC +2. So 8 p.m. tonight, the rankings will be live online, timeshighereducation.com. Really exciting. I mean, everybody here. I mean, how many universities are actually here now? And
So we think we've got, I'm a state scientist, I'm estimating here, I'd say we have between 100 and 150 university representatives here with us today. But in the rankings, we have 1,524 universities from 110 countries around the world.
wow, that's kind of a big number.
Not compared to big data, but yes, I take your point.
Yeah, but how many? I mean, if you look at you do other rankings as well.
Yes.
Yes. And is this a smaller ranking or like?
It's slightly small, so it's only 4 years old.
Yeah.
In the first year, we asked universities to submit, and universities behave very much like undergraduates when it comes to submitting things. So we set a deadline, and in the week of the deadline, on the Monday of that week, we had about 30 submissions, and I was getting very nervous. Is this going to be a ranking or an editorial list, which is what happens when you have a ranking that's too small. By the Thursday, we had about 120, and I always think 100 is about, if you've got 100, you've got a ranking. And then by the Friday of that week, we had 580 universities, which we were astounded by, really amazed by. But still, the growth since then, we've been growing by about 25% to 30% compound each year as more and more universities understand how important it is for them to demonstrate what they're doing around sustainability.
And to sort of be able to send in to the ranking. What I mean, is there any university, any site, any
university? We're trying not to limit this one.
Okay.
So for some of our rankings, we have entry criteria. So for research rankings, we require at least 1,000 publications over 5 years. But this isn't about that. This is about as many universities as possible from as many countries as possible. So really, we're open to pretty much any university. All we ask is that they are in good standing, something that I hope that KTH can achieve.
Hopefully. Well, I mean, I think this, no matter where we end up on the ranking this time, this is definitely one of my favorite rankings because I feel it is, it's not just sort of measuring the hard data, and it doesn't, because, and this is my opinion then, is that, sometimes the ranking, any ranking, not just university, but any ranking can be not counterproductive, but it can, it actually, if people are more concerned about what they're supposed to reach on the ranking,
agreed,
than actually doing the good job, then we can talk about the whole, the right answer syndrome thing of you're more concerned about what do they want me to answer instead of actually solving the problem.
Rather than doing the problem. Yes,
exactly.
Yes.
Which I think that this kind of addresses in a good way.
And we hope it does. I mean, but as I say, all rankings have problems. All rankings are wrong. Some of them can be useful. I hope this one is especially useful. I hope it drives change.
Yes.
And I hope you enjoy it, play with it, see what you can see, and then tell me.
Well, it's going to be great. Well, I will. I'm going to tell. No, but really, and I'm looking at the time here. We're actually come to the end of our half an hour. This is just a half an hour coffee break every Wednesday afternoon, usually 2:30 p.m. Today was 3:30 p.m. due to Duncan Ross's very, very busy schedule. But I'm so grateful that you spent a half an hour with me.
It's been a pleasure, Donny.
And I'm enlightened. I've learned a lot. I hope you've learned a lot. Thank you for the question, Ali. Let's see. We have another comment here. Let's see if there's a question or... here we go. LinkedIn user. Very insightful, this gentleman. Thanks. This is the first Fika discussion I've attended. Cheers from South Africa. Wonderful.
Hello, South Africa.
Hello, South Africa. It feels like the voting jury of the Eurovision Song
It really
Contest.
does, doesn't it?
Thank you so much. 2:30 p.m. every Wednesday afternoon. Duncan, good luck tonight.
Thank you very much.
Good luck tomorrow. And I will be following you 8 p.m. online.
8 p.m.
Take care, everyone. And with that, thank you and goodbye.